Hello everybody, welcome back. This video is for your second assignment for this week, so if you're paying attention to dates, I am looking at your work for your assignment that is due on Thursday the 23rd. So you are welcome to go through this information Wednesday or Thursday of this week, whatever is easiest and better for your schedule, and then to complete your assignment when you're done. If you have questions, if you're confused, please reach out. My email and my phone number are still listed here for you, but I have this calendar up and my green arrow kind of indicating where we are so far this week and where your assignment should be getting turned in. So this last part of our week, we're going to be talking about mixed factoring. So we have looked at a variety of different ways to factor so far. And we're just going to kind of review all of those ways today so that you can start to kind of put these pieces together in your assignment. We have talked about difference of squares. We've looked at binomials and pulled out that square root of every single value in our equation. We've talked about how to factor trinomials. We talked about that snowflake method last week. And then earlier this week, we talked about how to factor with grouping. That was what we were focusing on in the first part of this week. So let's go ahead and kind of work backwards. Let's start with what's freshest in our brain from this week to review, and then work backwards. Okay, so we need to start off by grouping. We'll start off with our 4 terms if we're going to review factoring those. Some things to keep in mind, some steps we need to remember. If we're going to factor things by grouping, we need to first keep our first 2 terms and our second 2 terms together. After we group those terms, we need to figure out what is our greatest common factor that we can remove from both our first term and our second term so we can divide them out. So here I see that there is an a squared that they both share. And when I divide out that a squared, I'm going to be left with a 2 and an a to the first power and a b in my first term. My second set of binomials, I see that I can go ahead and remove a 5 because they're both going to have that 5 in common. They can both be divided by 5. When I divide 10 by 5, I'm going to be left with a 2, and that a isn't going to go anywhere. And when I divide -5 by 5, I'm just going to be left with that b. The last thing that we talked about in order to come up with our solutions here was just to group the outside terms together and then to pay attention and make sure our inside terms were exactly the same. My computer is going a little bit slow here as it's trying to bring up that highlighter for us, but we see that a squared is going to go with our 5 because they're on the outside, and our 2a minus b we see in both parts of our inside of our parentheses, so we know we're good to go. And now I'm all set. I can go ahead and just write out my solution of my factored terms, a squared plus 5 and 2a minus b. So that's a quick little recap. My handwriting was terrible on that first a squared, so let's go ahead and fix that for you. That's a quick little recap of our factoring by grouping. Now, if we need to go ahead and use our snowflake, I'm going to go ahead and draw my snowflake in. We'll just do our first regular trinomial example. We know that anytime that we see something that has 3 terms, so something like what we see here, or if there is a value in front of that x, that first x, we're going to always be able to use that snowflake method. So I'm going to go ahead and draw in that snowflake that we know we're always going to use, that x. Ooh, that was terrible. Let's take 2 on that one. We will draw in, let's just use our lines, shall we? Make my life a little easier. We'll draw in our x and that line through the middle. So if we are following our first example here, x squared, we're going to put a little 1 in the front of each of those so we don't forget, minus 1x minus 42. We need to remember that our a's are always going to go on the side, our b is on the bottom of our snowflake, and our a times our C is on the top. So let's fill in what we know. We have our A's as 1, our B is a -1, be very careful with those negatives, and our C is a -42, so we're going to do 1 times -42, which we know is going to give us a -42. All right, so we've gone ahead and filled in that snowflake. We know we need to build the factor tree, what things multiply to give us 42. I know that 1 and 42 is going to give us 42. I know that 2 and 21 is going to give us 42. I know also that 6 and 7 are going to give us 42. And I'm going to choose these as the factors to work with because I know that if I make the 7 a negative, I can add them together to give me the bottom part of my snowflake. So 6 minus 7 gives me that -1. So I have my quote unquote fractions now that I can use to write out my solution. So I'm going to go ahead and do this here over to the side. I'm going to take the number on the top and put it with my x. So 1x plus 6 and 1x minus 7 makes my solution. So there is our quick review of our snowflake method. Anytime we see a trinomial, whether it is just the x or a number in front of the x, we can use that snowflake method. The last thing that we need to remind ourselves about is our difference of squares. We know every time we see a difference of squares, we are always going to have something plus something, and we're going to have something minus something. That's just the nature of those square roots. We know we're going to fill in both part of our parentheses. In order to do this, we need to take the square root of every single piece of our problem, every single piece of our binomial. We can use difference of squares when we see a binomial, when there are two terms that are being added or subtracted, and when we see that there is a square. So here we have an x squared in our problem. If we don't have that x squared, we shouldn't even try using a difference of squares. So if we take that square root of our x squared and the square root of our 64, we're going to have an x and an x at the beginning. Square root of 64 is going to be 8, so we know we just need to fill in that 8 into our second blank. So we have x plus 8 and x minus 8 as our solution. A quick reminder for us at the top so that we don't forget about this concept of finding greatest common factor. GCF, as a reminder, stands, we'll put it over here for ourselves, for greatest common factor. Sometimes we might see binomials that aren't a square, or maybe they're a number that there's a number that can be taken out of that polynomial first. It's important to pay attention to whether or not we have that greatest common factor. So let's take a little sneak preview at what our assignment is for this week. You are going to be using all of these different methods that we just reviewed in order to solve and just kind of refresh our brain on what we've been looking at. So the first two problems ask you to think about that difference of squares, making sure to take the square root of all the parts. The next two problems are a look at that basic trinomial. Because we have three terms, we know we can use that snowflake method. And our last two problems are going to ask us to solve by grouping, okay? So let's go ahead and I'm going to type in a couple hints here for you just so we don't forget, and also just to kind of help us out as we're working through these different problems, because I know it might have been a while since you've done these originally. So for numbers 7 and 8, you want to remember to take the square root of all parts of the problem, okay? And you're going to just fill in those two sets of parentheses. For number 11 and 12, you want to remember to use the snowflake method. If you have used another method to do your factoring, that's fine. Just make sure you're paying attention to the fact that there is no value in front of our variables here. And for number 21 and 22, you want to go ahead and group the first and second binomial pairs together first. Okay, so we want to do that grouping first before we go ahead and find the greatest common factor. Okay, so just a couple quick reminders for you as you're working through these problems. Feel free to pop into Zoom anytime over the next couple of days to let me know what questions you have. I'm happy to work through some of these problems in greater detail with you when you're done. Regardless of how you're feeling, please make sure you email and send me a picture of your work when you're finished so that I can enter those grades for you. All of this work is going to stay in our brains. We're going to spend this week and then next week you're going to have a little mini brochure activity to make sure that we can differentiate between when we're going to use each of these methods and how they work. It's not only important to be able to do them, but to decide when we should use them to come to our solutions. So again, questions, see me on Zoom. Otherwise, this assignment, which is on the Google Drive for you if you need it, is due on Thursday. Have a great day, everybody.